So what is the basis for our economy? It's the Federal Reserve and its credit system. The Federal Reserve is the central bank for this country. Over the years, the Federal Reserve has become a juggernaut. Where does the central bank come from? First, there was the Bank of England in 1694. This was the world's first central bank. The basis of the bank's establishment was to generate funds for a 5-year war with France. The Bank of England would later become the mold of our economy. The central banking system had its introduction into the United States after the Revolutionary War was over. Alexander Hamilton was acting Secretary of Treasury. He established the first Bank of America, a model from the Bank of England. However, this reserve never made it past the 20-year charter. In 1811, when the Bank of America was abolished, when Andrew Jackson was president. Jackson was a president who was most noticed for his sensitivity for the common man. That type of behavior was reflected in his decisions regarding the economy. Jackson understood the supreme influence certain bankers had on the economy when the Bank of America had its reign. In 1835, after the Bank of America had expired, Jackson paid off the final installment of the national deficit. He was the first and only president to do this. The government would eradicate all ties with the banking community for 75 years. Jackson followed Jefferson as a supporter of the ideal of an agricultural public, and felt the bank improved the fortunes of an elite circle of commercial and industrial entrepreneurs at the economic expense of farmers and laborers. At first, Jackson withdrew money from the bank to invest in other banks in regards to land sales, canal construction, and cotton production. This aided a manufacturing boom during this era. After a couple of years, this system began to fail. The local banks were printing too much money. They were printing cash without enough gold or silver to account for the value. And the result was a huge rise in inflation and large mounting state debts. The country went into a sudden depression 2 years after Jackson abolished the Bank of America. The motive behind Jackson's economic policy was to help the working class. If the local banks would have just operated more conservatively, this form of economics may have prospered. Several decades later, in 1907, there was a major depression in the economy. The stock market plummeted to 50% less than the year before, and this recession's primary cause was a record amount of loans called in by prominent New York banks and many other small-scale banks across the nation. The result of this was the Panic of 1907. A high-powered banker businessman, J.P. Morgan, found this the perfect time to step in and save the economy. Morgan organized a team of bank and trust executives. The team redirected money between the banks and secured further international lines of credit and bought plummeting stocks of healthy corporations. This allowed Morgan and some of his business partners like oil tycoon J.D. Rockefeller to expand their already vast empires. As a result of the Panic of 1907, they were able to buy up businesses for small fractions of what they were actually worth. Another result of the Panic of 1907 was when the U.S. government established the National Monetary Committee. Head of this committee was Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island. Aldrich was a very successful businessman. He also had ties to the Rockefeller family through his daughter's marriage. Aldrich was considered to be one of the most powerful politicians of his time. The group's job was to monitor other reserves in the rest of the world and come up with a structure for a supreme central bank to be created in the United States. A committee composed of greedy bankers and tycoons looking out for the good of the U.S. economy? Or does it seem more realistic that these men had more selfish intentions in mind? Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in November of 1913, and it became a law. The entire basis of the act came from the National Monetary Committee's design. Later, he had this to say. Now you know the history. But what is a central bank? What is its purpose and how does it operate? A central bank is a federal-backed bank with two key responsibilities for the nation. These tasks of the reserve are control interest and to control the money supply, thus controlling inflation. This is a government-run operation, but the Federal Reserve is still a profiting business. It operates just like a bank. The Fed was founded as a joint venture. It blends the interest of high-powered banks and the federal government. The money that is produced for the nation isn't just given to the government without baggage. Each dollar printed is loaned to them with interest, so every dollar is charged, plus a percentage brought on by the Federal Reserve. Oddly enough, the Federal Reserve's policies have never been changed by any legislation. The Federal Reserve has the authority to alter its policies and procedures without having to answer to any part of the government. So think about it realistically. The Federal Reserve creates the currency for a nation, then loans it to the government with interest. This combined with our growing debt with imports like oil, our economy is in the worst shape that it's ever been in. Unless changes are made, there is no way to ever climb out of the forever growing money pit. Immigration is something that you see in the headlines a lot. Bush has been ignoring the illegal immigrant problem in this country for reasons unknown to the public. He has broader intentions in mind. In 2005, Bush launched the Security Prosperity Partnership, or SPP. Its goal was to expand NAFTA. Recent as March 13th of this year, private meetings were held in Washington at the State Department discussing the integration of US, Canada, and Mexico. The next proposal of the SPP is the North American Union. Under the North American Union, our borders with Canada and Mexico will be erased. The Union will have 3 national languages, English, Spanish, and French. And people will be able to travel from country to country without immigration hassles. We will have one new currency for all 3 nations, which will be called the Amero. They can hire immigrants fresh into the country who will work long hours for cheap. It's almost like hiring illegal aliens in today's society, but when the North American Union comes into effect, this cheap exploit of American citizens will be perfectly legal. The goal of this act is to sustain the economy. I can't see the future, but it may be likely that it does help, at least for a while. However, it is my opinion that this will hurt the public in the long run. Manual labor will be cheaper than it has ever been. The days of leaving high school and getting a $15 an hour job at a factory are over, and those jobs are never coming back. There will not be a middle class left in the country once we form the North American Union. Already, most middle class families have to live on 2 or more jobs to provide for their family. And if history repeats itself, no generation will have it easier than the one before.